If you remember from the lecture about the Middle East, not long after this, during World War I, the British and the French began making plans for the partition of the Middle East following World War I. With the loss, the defeat of the Ottoman Empire and the breaking up of its lands, its territories, there was an opportunity here. And the British declared in 1917 that they supported the idea of creating a national Jewish home in Palestine in some of these lands that were being re-territorialized. In 1922, the League of Nations approved a British mandate over Palestine, essentially turning Palestine into a kind of British colony. At that time, the population in the area was overwhelmingly Muslim, but there were about 84,000 Jews, 71,000 Christians, and some others there as well. Jews fleeing persecution in Europe increasingly sought to migrate to Palestine, especially in the 1930s. But this had begun much earlier. They had created the Jewish National Fund and used those monies to buy land in Palestine from the Arab owners, sometimes Ottoman owners, of those lands, and provide those lands to migrating Jews to settle and live. And this took a while to get going. As you can see, in 1922, there still weren't that many Jews there. They were a small minority of the population. But that was up significantly from, say, 1870, when the numbers were much, much smaller. Here's a map showing this is the Palestine Mandate granted to Great Britain in 1920, would have extended into Transjordan. This is the approximate area where the Zionists themselves hoped to set up a Jewish state. This is the Golan Heights, which were ceded to the French Mandate of Syria by the British in 1923. This was not met happily by the Arabs living in the area. They began to riot as early as 1920. It became more organized resistance over time, and by 1936, the Arabs in the area had organized a general strike, a refusal to work. This was met by systematic military repression by the British and by Jewish forces, in which 5,000 Palestinians died compared to only 400 Jews and 200 British soldiers. An estimated 10% of Palestinian adult males were either killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled. This was a reassertion of British control over the territory. The British for a long time maintained that they were going to partition this area into two independent states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs. This plan was sort of official policy until 1939. At that point, they proposed a single independent state that would be established 10 years later. When it was established, according to this plan, power, governmental political rule, would be proportional to the population of Jews and Arabs at that time. So this obviously would have created a powerful incentive for the Zionists to get as many Jews there as possible in the next 10 years in hopes of increasing their share of power at the time of independence. However, anticipating that that would be a problem and facing Arab opposition, the British also ruled that there would be no more than 75,000 Jews allowed to immigrate each year until 1944, and then after that, these movements would be contingent on Arab consent. And so the plan at that point looked pretty clear that by 1949, the state would be given independence and it would be a majority Muslim Arab state. And you can see here, as of 1946, Arabs greatly outnumbered Jews in almost all the parts of the area, except here on the coast. Even around Jerusalem, they were about almost two-thirds of the population, and obviously this would have meant a primarily Arab state. But this didn't happen, in part because World War II intervened and threw all these cards up in the air again. The United Nations approved a partition plan in 1947, which would have divided the area like this. You would have had an Arab state running like this. Jerusalem would have been held in UN trusteeship, and the Jewish state would have occupied these orange areas. However, a day before the mandate was to expire, Israel declared its independence. Just said, no, we're in charge, this is us, we're a state, just much the way the United States declared its independence in 1776, right? We're just going to take charge, take the initiative. However, the neighboring Arab states, organized in the form of the Arab League, declared war and promptly lost. The Green Line, established under the terms of the armistice at the end of that war in 1949, redrew the map. Instead of this map, which would have been the map under the partition plan, you got this map in which all of this would be Jewish Israel, and this area, the West Bank, not including or touching on Jerusalem, would be all that was left for Palestine. So 78% of the territory that previously would have been Palestine was in fact inside the Green Line, meaning inside the area now claimed by Israel. Of the approximately 873,000 Palestinians who lived in those areas before partition, various kinds of forced relocation and military conflicts and migrations, refugee movements, diminished that to just 155,000 afterwards. The refugees from this conflict in 1950 numbered just under 1 million, more than half of them in Jordan, including the West Bank. In 1979, they had doubled in numbers, including nearly 500,000 in the occupied West Bank, which is occupied now by Israel. And as of 1999, there were 3.6 million Palestinian refugees. We're specifically talking about refugees here, not Palestinians of all kinds. Only 82,000 of them were left in the West Bank. Nearly 800,000 were in the Gaza Strip, and 1.1 million were living in camps elsewhere. Here you see a map. The large circles are 100,000 people, smaller ones 50,000, 10,000, 5,000, etc. This is a blow-up of the Gaza Strip. You can see there are quite a few very large camps there. Total of 900,000 in the Gaza Strip. You can see many of them here in Jordan as well. These are refugee camps that have actually become sort of permanent cities. Right? This is one of the types of slums in Davis's typology, right? Refugee camps. We tend to think of them as temporary. And these were, in a sense, set up as though they would be temporary, but they have now been there for more than 50 years. They are very dense. Some of them are built up and look like fairly ordinary cities in terms of the buildings and the streets. Others of them look very much like refugee camps. The total population of Palestinians in the world in 2000 was estimated at nearly 8.5 million. 1 million of them in Gaza, 1.8 million in West Bank, almost 1 million in Israel, 2.5 million in Jordan. Others spread throughout the Middle East and actually elsewhere, including here in the United States. One of the big questions remains, this is the reason we're talking about this is partially because of territoriality and illustrating it, partially because this remains one of the most intractable conflicts in global politics right now, right? And one of the big issues is precisely that if it were one state, not only do the Palestinians, now known as Palestinians, they weren't known as Palestinians before all this happened, they were just Arabs. But the creation of Israel and the creation of Palestine have sort of turned them into this new class of people or nation of people known as Palestinians. And they outnumber Jews if you include the whole area. and their population growth rate has typically been greater than that of the Jewish Israelis. And to that extent, any electoral democracy is likely to result in a majority Arab or majority Palestinian government, which obviously flies in the face of the entire project of Zionism insofar as it envisioned not just a nation but a nation state, a state in which Jews would represent sort of a different class of citizen, or rather citizenship would itself require a certain religious faith. How are we doing for time? Going to have to go quickly. The Suez Crisis in 1956 anticipated many of the subsequent battles that have been fought, wars that have been fought since that time. You remember this is the time of sweeping independence. Egypt had recently gained independence, and they began in coalition with neighboring Arab states to assert their new independence. They built up, particularly in the Suez Peninsula, and they decided in 1956 to nationalize the Suez Canal, to declare that it now belongs to the newly independent Egyptian state. This was, as we remember from earlier lectures, a huge, important strategic asset for world trade, and particularly for the British and French, and they did not take kindly to this. Britain and France and Israel decided to attack Egypt to retake the Suez Canal. They won the war, this skirmish for the Suez, but it in fact represented sort of the final attempt by the British to assert their prominence on the world stage. The U.S. was not very supportive of this because it was now more concerned about the Soviet Union, and this was seen as Britain trying to sort of assert the kind of authority and power that they no longer really had in the world. In any case, a UN emergency force was put in place to hold the peninsula after this sort of played itself out. In May of 1967, Egypt threw that force out of the Sinai and began to build its forces there, and they closed the Straits of Tiran right here, such that Israel no longer had access to trade through those straits. Israel attacked to preempt a military invasion. Jordan and Syria joined with Egypt, backed by other Arab nations, and again lost in 6 days. This is the famous Six-Day War. And this sets up the sort of framework in which Delaney then unpacks the ways in which territoriality in particularly the occupied West Bank has played out since that time. He suggests that it's a territorial complex, 2 territorial planes, that of sovereignty and that of property, and at their intersection. Sovereignty, he says, consists largely in the practical ability to establish rules in an unhindered fashion over a given territory. Property consists, again, as we discussed, of actual ownership in an economic sense of land. These two come together. The formation of Israel rested on a longer prior history of the Jewish National Fund and Zionists buying land and consolidating property claims, and then attempting to transform those property claims into sovereignty claims, which they achieved with the creation of Israel in 1948. Where only 6% of land in what would become Israel had been owned by Jewish organizations in 1947, by the 1960s they owned more than 94%. Over half of the West Bank is owned by Israel. Even though it's not technically part of the sovereign state of Israel, it is occupied territory. The precise point of the post-1967 territorialization here is to hold the vast majority of Palestinians on the outside of Israel proper, but on the inside of the control system of Greater Israel, and to regulate movement between these sectors. Here, I think the case of Arizona is rather pertinent. What we have is a circumstance in which a certain territory is both inside and outside of, well, certain people within that territory are both inside and outside. They are inside physically, but they are outside in the sense that they are not citizens, or they do not have the full rights of citizenship. And this nebulous space is one in which political control can be exerted in a kind of unaccountable fashion, and in which the purpose seems precisely to keep these people in this kind of limbo. The Arizona economy would collapse in the absence of illegal immigrants. They can't not be there for the sake of the economy. But their persecution is part of ensuring that weak status as laborers, right? And the xenophobia expressed in this recent legislation is only a flaring up of long-standing racial tensions and fears about immigration, made much worse by recent events along the border. Anyway, here we see a depiction of the checkpoints, a map of the checkpoints that the Israeli military has established in the West Bank, in the occupied territories. You'll notice that virtually every road has got one. This is the same for Gaza. You see here the kinds of, what it actually might look like to go through one of these checkpoints. And Delaney describes how these checkpoints are not only very systematic, but they're also rather capricious. The rules for who can go through, what paperwork you need, tend to be somewhat unpredictable, very complicated. You need different permits to take a vehicle versus just walking. You need different permits if you're going to spend the night than if you're not going to spend the night. There's no telling how many permits will be available from this month to next, that sort of thing. And all of this has the effect, he's suggesting, of maintaining this very peculiar position for Arabs in the area. This is from a couple years ago. They have begun to, and I think they're quite far along now, building an astonishing wall, which in theory would have followed or is supposed to follow the Green Line, and according to the logic is there to prevent the incursion of terrorists. But as this map shows and as Delaney describes, the wall in fact does not follow the Green Line precisely, and in many cases runs right through towns, cutting off people in their towns from the farm fields where they work, that kind of thing. Here it's compared to the Berlin Wall. The technologies in fact are quite similar, if more high-tech at this point. Almost 40% of the West Bank's agricultural area and 2/3 of its water resources will be on the Israel side of the wall. So the wall seems designed very carefully to alter the, if not the legal distribution, at least the access and use of natural resources such as land and water. The wall has provoked an artist, murals that poke certain kinds of fun at it. There have been a lot of protests associated with this, if it's not surprising. This is the wall cutting through Jerusalem, 25 feet high. This is construction. You can see it's a rather remarkable structure. Here again, there's been a kind of dual approach. There's the physical occupation of land by building settlements, frequently in areas that are not technically part of Israel, and thereby putting in place Israelis who are effectively controlling that land with or without official legal sanction in terms of the various agreements about occupation and that sort of thing. So the green here are the municipal boundaries of Israeli settlements. The pink are areas that were nominally under Palestinian authority this is a situation that's changing rapidly, but the point here is that Israel has built hundreds and hundreds of settlements with hundreds of thousands of people moving in over the last 25 years, effectively exerting a kind of control over this area regardless of its legal status. A lot of these settlements are built on the top of hills with a variety of design features that help fortify them or protect them, provide surveillance over the surrounding lowlands where the fields tend to be located. Israelis are not considered to have crossed a meaningful border while in the occupied territories. They are still effectively inside because they are Israeli citizens and they have the appropriate paperwork. In a sense, the Green Line always surrounds them. Needless to say, Palestinians are prohibited from entering the settlement enclaves except as laborers. He describes this as an internal occupation. He stresses that this is not simply lines on a map. It's actually almost lines inside the bodies of people as they move between these different spaces, and their different legal statuses change the rules in which they are living and forced to interact with space and with other people. Territory is the space within which occupation takes place, but it is not just the territories that are occupied. People, lives, time, social reality are all occupied, controlled by and for the benefit of the others. Nothing is untouched by the processes and practices of occupation. So now I raise the question of the fence between the United States and Mexico. These pictures are actually somewhat old. This is near Douglas, Arizona, where I've done a lot of work. You'll notice that it's been blazed through some awfully rugged territory, particularly in the last 3 months of the Bush administration. There was an enormous push made by the Department of Homeland Security and its contractors to complete hundreds of miles of barriers along the border. And it was done in an incredibly rapid and heavy-handed manner over the objections not only of groups that might advocate for Mexican Americans or migrants, but also over the objections of a lot of local landowners who saw no need for this. The area in particular where I've worked, building a wall like this or a barrier like this necessarily meant building a road like this. And there are large areas of the border in Arizona where there were no roads previously anywhere near the border. And now there are. And what you see if you're a local person and you live there and you watch is that there's more traffic now, precisely because as soon as anybody gets across the border, whether they're moving people or moving drugs, they now have a road. And that road is extremely useful to them. Previously, they would have had to be on horseback or on foot. Now they can be in a vehicle. And in fact, very near here, within weeks of the construction of new barriers, people showed up on the Mexican side with trucks and torches, and they cut chunks of the barrier out, lifted it out of the way, and drove across the border and made their way in the United States. In many ways, the fence has been simply counterproductive in these areas. Nonetheless, it's built, hundreds and hundreds of miles of it, and it will have, as previously found with virtually every such wall ever built anywhere, basically no effect. It will not actually succeed, right? The Great Wall of China being the biggest example of this, but the Berlin Wall and these barriers, and the barriers in Israel perhaps, being more recent examples. Somehow we seem unable to learn this. It seems so obvious that a wall would somehow work. But the very reason it needs to be built testifies to the fact that it can't succeed, right? If you didn't need to build it, there wouldn't be a force counterposing it, and that force, in fact, is more powerful than any wall can be. Are there any questions about Palestine? Yes? The Green Line is exactly, technically, it's the armistice line from the end of the 1967 war, which is the basic territorial template from which all negotiations depart at this point. In other words, that's the sort of baseline. And it is technically, under the terms of the armistice, the line that is supposed to separate Israel from Palestinian territory, or land that would be Palestinian under whenever this issue gets resolved. But the fact is that with the settlements, the interpenetration, so to speak, of Israel and its citizens with that territory on the other side of the Green Line is so thorough that the idea that you could somehow just make the Green Line the border is not really a resolution to the situation. One other thing I meant to mention there, he describes this as well. I don't know, have any of you been to the occupied territories in recent years? No? I've had a number of students who've been there and come back and describe this. They're constructing sort of dual transportation systems as well. They're constructing highways that are basically only for Israelis, and other highways that are basically for everyone else. And they're built in such a way that even where they cross, they don't effectively intersect. Yeah. So that basically, if you're Israeli, you can get on these highways and drive through Palestinian land or areas that are not part of Israel and not worry about whether you're going to actually share the road with non-Israelis. And this is a pretty complicated engineering thing to pull off, right? I mean, you're sort of creating, they have to cross each other, but they can't actually connect. And this resembles in many ways the kinds of things that Davis is talking about in the construction of off-worlds for the affluent in the world's major cities. All right, we're done. We made it. And in the next 10 or 15 minutes, I'm going to try to summarize what we've done. These are my major points. I hope that over the course of the semester, you have learned something and come away with some ideas about regions, about scales, about processes, about space-time, about capitalism, and about globalization. Some of these slides I've shown before.